Inference Plus Story Short Number 10, Series B. At the very back of the farm's South 40, there was a hole in the ground. At one point or another, it had been a well, but the water had dried up decades ago, so now it was just a hole, a deep, dark hole, bored into the ground so far down all you could see was black. And even when you threw in the biggest rock you could find, you never heard it hit the bottom. Somewhere along the line, a cover had been built and bolted across the top, but the wood had grown soft and easy to scrape away in crumbling bits, even for hands as small as Jimmy's and mine. Daddy told us to stay away from that hole in the ground and said he'd paddle us if he so much as thought we'd been near it. And he said he'd know if we lied, and he'd paddle us again for lying. The warnings only served to make us more curious about the hole in the ground and had the opposite of Daddy's desired effect. On hot summer days, Jimmy and I would take off and run across the fields with our dirty, bare feet to fish for crawdads and play army men in the hayloft. But inevitably, we'd find our faces pressed against the rotted wood over the hole in the ground, shouting into it to see if there was an echo and wondering how far down it went. "I'll bet it's 100 feet, I said. "I'll bet it's 1,000 feet, Jimmy said, with the gleeful exuberance possessed only by 5-year-old boys and Labrador puppies. One particularly arid July afternoon, we had the epiphany that it would be great fun to spit into the hole. "Mother says we're not supposed to spit," Jimmy said earnestly, "'cause it's unsanitary and common." "Mother's not here," I replied sheepishly, and we grinned. And so we pressed our mouths to a crack in the wood and proceeded to spit. We were delighted by our childish subterfuge and rolled around laughing in the sun-baked grass until our sides hurt and our bodies were blanketed with chigger bites. As the sun began to dip low and fiery in the sky, we knew supper would be ready soon. It was determined that we would each have one more spit into the hole before tramping home to face the inevitable bath Mother would already have for us in the tub on the back porch. We each horked up our finest loogie, determined to make our final spit our best one yet, a loogie for the ages. We played a fast game of rock, paper, scissors to decide who would spit first, and I won. I rolled the mouthful of spit around one final time, then spat with all the force I had in me into the hole in the ground. Next came Jimmy, who mimicked me exactly just the way he always did. Satisfied with our efforts, we began to walk towards home, scratching at the chigger bites that suddenly seemed to remember they should itch. And that's when we heard a sound come from the hole in the ground. It was a sound like a whisper, but with a hint of a cat's hiss. Couldn't make out the words, but I had sense enough to be afraid. Jimmy, being younger and still untouched by the evils of the world, the real ones or the ones you see in the movie matinees, was simply curious. He crept back over to the hole in the ground and pressed an eye to the spit crack. "Hello?" he called out in awed fascination. "Who's down there?" Not a trace of fear in him, but I felt my guts start to rumble. "Come on, Jimmy," I said, my voice sounding like it came from someone else. "Let's go home." But Jimmy let out an awful scream, even worse than the one he'd made when he stepped on a tacking nail in the barn and Mother had to pull it out with pliers. When he pulled his face away from the hole in the ground, a sharp stick as wide as my thumb protruded at an angle from his eye, and blood ran down his cheek into the startled gape of his mouth. After that first blood-curdling howl, he didn't make another sound until the doctor at St. Vincent's offered him a lollipop for his trouble. He lost the eye, and Daddy whipped me with a belt, because if I wanted to make a man's mistakes, I deserved to get a man's punishment. I didn't care about the whipping, and I didn't make a single sound while he did it. I was older and should have been the one to know better. They just assumed we'd been playing army men with sticks and things had gotten out of hand, and I didn't correct them. I suspect if Daddy knew what we'd really been up to, I'd have gotten more than just the whipping. After the initial shock, Jimmy was pleased enough to spend the next several years wearing an eye patch because it made him look like a pirate. But when he got old enough to notice girls, the fall he turned 14, we drove the truck up to St. Louis and he got his glass eye, followed by a date to the fall fling with Beatrice Price. It felt like the end of the whole thing after that, and I was glad. We never went back to the hole in the ground.